Hello, welcome to Garden Chronicles. My name is James David, and this particular video is actually a collection of all the garden sets that I've managed to cultivate and grow throughout the years. And this is somehow sort of like more of an experiment and also like a learning lesson for me in a way to realize what plants actually goes well and what doesn't. But throughout the time, it is very much more on a fun and adventure kind of a setup. And I would like to share some few tips on how I cultivate a small garden space, more of creating a beautiful landscape here in my garden. And I hope that you enjoy it and get some pointers and tips from this particular video. Another factor that I would like to share here is that how I set up this ideal garden space and the things that I've learned throughout the years. And as I mentioned earlier, that this is very much of a collection of all the garden videos that I put together, and I hope you can enjoy for your viewing pleasure. So sit back and enjoy the show. Important tip, and I hope that I'm able to condense it and mention here properly and accurately. And this is what I want to say, that plant something that you love and the plant that does well in your garden space, especially in your garden condition. Also, the same plant should supposed to suit to your lifestyle. That is to say that if you're too busy to care for the plant and you can only give attention to that particular plant or your garden for once a week, and so that should fit in according to your lifestyle, instead of you trying to fit the garden plant's care and force yourself into it. Rather, it should be the reverse way, that if you can only give 1 hour per week, or that it would be something like a minimum, like comes to a place of pruning and feeding and that kind of stuff like that, and that is the attention that you can give to. So these are the plants that you should cultivate, so that you won't it won't eat up your time and that will stress you up. So this is one of the things that I want to make an emphasis here, because over the years that I've actually learned and cultivate a garden, and this is what I want to make mention, is that this is the successful way to have a successful garden in based on your lifestyle. So let me explain the tip number one. It's the factor number one is that plant the plants that you love. So this is going to be a little bit of a great challenge, just because you will really never know until you introduce the plant into your garden space, and you have to change the plants according to your garden need. And the way what I mentioned is change the plant, is that change the potting medium and sort of like acclimatizing the plant so that it's sort of like weather the storm in your garden space, that if at all it receives too much water, that it won't rot, or if at all that is inadequate of water, there's enough moisture on the root system, and therefore it is just ideal that this particular plant survive. I'm not saying that every plant it does good in your garden space, especially when it comes to tropical garden. It can be a hardy plant, but sometimes the potting medium can be not be the right thing to do, and sometimes it can be also the watering, where if you overwater it, it can be detrimental for the plant, or maybe underwatering can make the plant perish. So these are the things that it's a lot to do with trial and error, and basically is that sometimes plants can be very expensive, especially beautiful plants. And so the only way to do it here is to figure out something that what you love and what you enjoy in your garden, and slowly acclimatizing it and trying it out and see whether it works or not. It does not really work well in many spectrums of plants. Like for example, if it's a flowering plant or edible plants, some plants may require a bright direct sunlight, especially like vegetables or even flowering plants like hibiscus and all that. And if your garden space is something like mine, where it has limited sunlight that it gets, so in a way to say that figuring out what works best was the actual journey that it took me over the years. So sometimes even like plants like orchids, where it's supposed to be a shade loving plant, it's supposed to bloom properly, and it's supposed to get an ideal condition for it to grow and bloom and flourish. However, I find that it is not true in my garden space. They can stay alive. They can be come to now stasis where it can be all leaves and roots, but rarely does it bloom. And if I were to overfeed it using strong fertilizer, they can get burns. And I had a horrible experience with pest problems. Especially orchids can be very, very sensitive and finicky, and it took me for many years to slowly cultivate and figuring it out. And with so many trials and error, I've just given up hope with orchids. So eventually I have moved on to bromeliads, and I find the bromeliads are hardy, but they can be a little bit messy if they have overgrown. It is again a lot to do with trying and figuring it out and check and balance. There are some plants, something like apiceas, that are very beautiful. I love colored plants, so I switched from flowers to foliage and colorful foliage. But again, some plants do have short lifespan, and that is another challenge of constantly trimming and propagating it and cultivating it for another set, which I find that it can be difficult if the plant does not grow or suffer stress. Again, as I said, that pest problem is number one issue in my garden space, where I was not able to get a proper good pesticide for it to be controlled. Hence, I've lost a lot of my collection due to that factor. So there's a lot of things that you have to figure out on the proper balance. But once the balance has been achieved, that is the element of successful gardening. Coming back to point number two, that is plants that does well in my garden space. As you would have noticed that I have started moving away from orchid and switched to begonias, and I find that in the beginning begonia was doing fine because they are very much of indoor plant, shade loving plant. But the problem with that is that they too have challenges, and especially the thing about begonias is that they are very unforgiving plants. That is, if you were to make a small mistake or if you made a mistake, they will just perish easily. So one of the things is that they are very sensitive, and they can have, like especially certain species or cultivars, do have a very short lifespan. And the problem here is that I would never know about their characteristics until I tried it out, more of a trial and error. And sometimes it's just you have to try so many times and figuring it out exactly what went wrong. And I find that one of the major problems that I actually face is lack of humidity, or in some cases that it can be too humid due to the timing of a year, where sometimes that if it's a very a long extensive rainy season, and it will be very humid, and then sometimes it'll be very wet, and that can also cause root rot. And there are times in certain part of the year where it can be hot and dry, and that can actually cause some burns, and irregular watering can also stress them up. So begonia is not a type of plant that can actually go through something like weather the storm, where they require constant humidity or non-change factor in a garden space. Whereas in my garden is that there is kind of a cycle that takes place, where sometimes during the 6 months time the sun comes out from this side, and another 6 months time the sun comes from the other side, simply because my garden is actually facing the southern part of, so as it faces the south. And so I will actually have the sun sort of like very hot and bright towards the east side, and at the next set will be more on the western side. It's sort of like very funny when you're actually staying by the hillside, and especially in a tropical region, a lot of things is not as how it appeared to be as constant as you think it is, but it's not. So these are the things that certain plants may not able to tolerate when it comes to constant humidity, and actually do not have that in my garden. So coming back to that continuation, that I also find that through a factor of experimenting and figuring it out, I find that certain plants that I able to do very well, which I also like, are cascading hanging plants. So it's in a way that is to hang them on hanging basket kind of a thing and let the plants cascade down. And I find that in this kind of factor, especially when it comes to ferns or ferns allies such as Huperzia, air plants, Hoya, Decidia, and I find that in this kind of things actually require a little bit of a skill and and to attain a certain element where you have to actually know exactly what do they need by the change of the color, and sometimes they may look a little bit jaded, and you know that it's receiving too much sun, and at times a little bit of sudden rot that takes place, and you may have to figure out the right element of a potting medium. And so I actually use a lot of coconut chips together with sand, and I find that these drain faster and at the same time hold enough moisture for the root ball, so in a way that check and balance that it doesn't dry out fully and it doesn't die in my garden if there is a lack of water. And so I find that this works best in my garden condition. So slowly but surely, I've also slowly introduced Aroids in my garden space, and I find that they are quite hardy and easy to care for, especially photos, syngonium, Dieffenbachias, and also some philodendron and monstera. They can be very forgiving, and they can actually tolerate a certain element of abuse where they can actually handle too much water, especially when rain comes upon them, or they can also face some dry spells if there's too much hot sun during another 6 months period of time where it's a hot and dry spell. So in a way, I find that I would really prefer to grow hardy plants and those that actually give colors and sort of will be give about a kind of the tropical look, and sort of that it doesn't overgrow and become too messy and invasive. At the same time, I don't want to have a plant that constantly dies and not doesn't do well properly in my garden. So eventually I found a proper equilibrium in my garden space, and I find that the point number two is to figure out and know that plants that does well in your garden space, and with the point number one is that the plants that you love, and figure out with these two both factors is one of the most key important factor when I garden and throughout my garden journey, and I want to make an emphasis on these points. Finally, the tip number three is to figure out between these two plants that you love and the plants that does well in your garden space, and to find that timing and your lifestyle where to find and fit the plants that fit into your lifestyle. I can never make enough emphasis on this, because there are sometimes I find that most of the gardeners, or especially the new beginner gardeners, where they will just go into a nursery and they'll just pick up all the sensitive plants and the plants that really require daily watering and proper care, and they can just go for a holiday of weeks, and when they come back and see the whole garden actually has perished. And one of the factor here is that there is no one to look forward for the watering, or maybe they would have just overwatered for that first few days, thinking that the plant will be able to survive for another 1 week's time. And by the time they come back, it's actually heartbreaking. And some of the gardeners just hope that it rains on that particular week so that it is covered. Or may also come across cases where they are asked for their friends to water their garden, and in cases where the garden has been flooded with water and the whole plant has perished because of root rot. So these are the things that is the factor of heartaches. And the thing that I want to mention here is that to be able to figure out the plants that actually fit in, where you don't really have to face this kind of heartaches. And these are the things that I would personally avoid, because I don't want to go for a holiday thinking what will actually happen to my plants. And one of the things that I actually learned throughout these experiences is that I find that in a long-term journey is that if at all I do go for a holiday, I will normally figure out and ask anybody around to actually help me out to water the garden in a way, at least maybe 3 days once, because I've already accustomed my garden plants to be able to handle the weather in a way that if they don't get watered at least for 2 days, at the third day, and they can actually handle 3 days without watering. So these are the things that I have found that it works best, especially when it comes to medium and the type of plant that is being cultivated. I must say there are some plants that do require daily watering, especially the type of plants that is actually exposed to direct hot sun, and you can't do much unless you have a very good watering system or self-watering system that actually does this job. Otherwise, I would actually recommend that if you can actually invest more on certain devices that it's very much fixed with timer, and it does the watering system, and it can be expensive. And if you don't want to invest such as that, then the best alternate way is to grow hardy plants. And I find that certain plants can have that hardy characteristics, especially even begonias, when they can have a kind of a succulent kind of behavior, especially the ones that comes under the Aroid family. So come to the conclusion of my video. As I mentioned here, do not forget the three main elements here. You can actually imagine it as the three circles that comes together: the plants that you love, the plants that does well in your garden space, and the plants that you can take care of based on your lifestyle. So you just put the three rings or the three circles together and figure out the ones that comes in the center, and that is your ideal plant. So I've now come to the end of my video, and if you can, I would really appreciate if you can click like, subscribe, and support my channel. And I would really like to know where you actually viewing this particular video from, and say hi from where you are. Like if you are from US and your name, and just say I'm Sally and I'm from Kentucky or something like that, and I would really appreciate, and I will say hi from here, and I definitely will reply to any of your queries that and any questions that you have based on cultivating garden, and I will obliged to answer based on my experience and my knowledge. So I hope you enjoyed my video. Hope to see you again in my next one. Take care and have a nice day. Bye.